Sounds like Jill's around remodeling her kitchen.
Now I have an upstairs fridge, which is fantastic. I've turned my camera on there, right?
Hello.
So how hungover were you on Sunday morning?
We're now live, Jill, so thank you for that. Perfect time. What a way to start the new term. Welcome, everyone, to the first of the post-summer UK and a Changing Europe lunch hours. We're going to try and discuss over the next hour what the big, meaty policy challenges facing the new government are. Joining me are, in the order I can see them, Sarah Hall, University of Cambridge, UK and a Changing Europe Deputy Director, Ben Zaranko from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Jonathan Portes, King's College and UK and a Changing Europe, and last but not least, Jill Rutter, UK and a Changing Europe, and sometimes the Institute for Government as well. As ever, if you're on the slide, well, you must be on the Slido, do put your questions in the chat, as some of you are already doing, and do please vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel. So skipping swiftly on from Jill's hangover question, we'll start with something a little bit more relevant, which is for all of you. What do you think the biggest challenge facing this new government is? And I'm going to start with you, Jonathan.
I think fairly obviously, the government has said that growth is the priority for a number of pretty good reasons, in particular that growth is what is needed both to improve living standards and to generate the resources needed to improve the dire state of our public services, which are the things that people are most concerned about most. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that in the short term, our growth performance doesn't look bad. It compares reasonably well, both with our performance over the last few years and with some other major European countries. So the sort of short-term growth outlook is not bad, but that's not really the issue. The issue is growth over the medium to long term, which has been pretty pathetic over the past 15 years or so since the global financial crisis. And the challenge is, well, what is Labour actually going to do to move the dial on this? And so far, at least, and of course it is very early days yet, they seem to have sort of ruled out doing some of the things that might actually make a significant difference, for example, substantial step change to public investment. And I think it is early days yet, so I think it's sort of unfair to say, well, why haven't you changed the long-term growth prospects of the UK? Because no one can do that in a few weeks. But I think there's still a large gap between the actually, in my view, quite sensible rhetoric on this topic and the reality of what there is in terms of concrete policy proposals.
Okay, thank you very much. Short and sweet, Ben.
At the risk of just saying what IFS people always say, I think one big challenge this autumn is going to be how they strike the balance between the various commitments on tax, on spending, and on Rachel Reeves's supposedly ironclad fiscal rules. And we've seen already a bit of this over the summer with her unveiling in-year overspends and cutting things like winter fuel payments for better off pensioners to make up some of the gap. And I think that whether she can reconcile this promise not to raise the big taxes, promising improvements in public services, and promising to have debt falling by the end of the Parliament and only to be borrowing for investment, threading that needle, striking that balance, I think will be really difficult and will be one of the big arguments that we see over the next 6 months to a year.
Just a specific question to follow up on that. I don't know if you heard Lucy Powell on Sunday. She did the media round. She did the Westminster Hour that evening, and saying that if we hadn't done what we'd done to the winter fuel allowance, we risked to run on sterling because the finances are so bad. What did you make of that?
I didn't think it was a particularly helpful contribution to the fiscal policy debate. I think if the difference between us having a run on the pound and not is a £1.5 billion change to winter fuel payments, we've got big problems on our hands. I think there is a good and a principled argument to be made for fiscal restraint at this moment in time. I'm just not sure that that was it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah.
Giving you time to finish your lunch.
Okay, cool. I've had my lunch, so all good. Yeah, I think one of the areas that I'm really interested in seeing what happens this autumn is the sort of regional devolution question. I think it's quite clear to me that as part of within the wider remit of growth, how that growth is distributed across the UK is really important. We know that the UK has one of the most economically uneven trajectories of similar economies. And I think we've seen some early signs of how this government might approach this in a different way. So we've seen the government department name change being announced, ditching the Boris Johnson slogan of levelling up. You could see that as a kind of not exactly a machinery of government question, but a sort of a naming question. I actually think it points to some quite interesting changes that seem to be evident in their approach to the regional question, and particularly a shift in scale. So levelling up was a really highly localised set of interventions in a lot of ways, focusing on things like high streets, distinctive local communities. And clearly a lot of those have economic problems that need addressing, like coastal communities, for example. It seems to me that this government is more interested at the kind of metro mayor and devolved authority scale of intervention. I think that presents quite a lot of opportunities in terms of stimulating growth around things like infrastructure, planning, and skills. But I think it will also be interesting to see how Labour mayors, or predominantly Labour metro mayors, brush up against a Labour government when difficult decisions need to be made or when things potentially go wrong. So, for example, things like potential collapses of universities or those kinds of things. So when challenges come down the tracks, how does that sort of political relationship work?
Lovely, thank you. Jill.
I know we're going to talk about policies, but we'll get into lots of policies. But I think the really difficult thing that anyone faces when they come into power after being out of power for 14 years is just adjusting to being in government. I mean, very different ways of working. Keir Starmer had quite an early, if you like, sheep dip in how much foreign policy would intrude. And we've seen that today, again, with the big row over the government's decision on arms export licenses. Much easier in opposition just to sort of posture. In government, you have to decide, and that gets difficult. I think it's really interesting. I thought that in July, the government made really quite a strong start getting going. We had very swift cabinet appointments. They very sensibly appointed almost all the people who'd shadowed positions into the matching cabinet position. One forced change in terms of Thangam Debere not getting elected, replaced by Lisa Nandy. One unforced change, and we'll see how that plays out longer term, by the ditching of Emily Thornberry and her replacement by Richard Hermer as Attorney General. But I think, and I thought the government made quite a strong start. I thought Keir Starmer dealt very well with the immediate aftermath of the riots. If you like, that was a sort of crisis made for Keir Starmer because it was the one where he had got prior experience he could bring to that. But I think, the government is now going to face an autumn of where you have to move from announcements into delivery. We've already seen a new Labour backbencher tabling a motion against the winter fuel allowance increase. It'll be very interesting. It's a newly elected Labour MP who's already decided to take on the government on that. It's quite interesting. We've had 7 MPs suspended over their support for the SNP amendment to the King's speech on the two-child limit on benefits. So interesting to see how that all works out. And Labour's got itself embroiled in an absolutely unnecessary, but if you like, foreseeable row about just trying to dodge some of the numbers optics on special advisor appointments by making people civil servants who really should be special advisors. And that's something that my colleagues at Institute for Government have called an unforced error. And that's the sort of thing you would have thought that this government should have been able to guard against. It should be very, very well informed on these issues. And I think one of the really interesting questions is, as an early test, is, they talked a lot about missions before coming into government, but actually, is that anything different? Our mission board's just a bunch of cabinet committees. Very interestingly, the cabinet committees haven't, as far as I can see, or hadn't as of last week, been announced yet. The cabinet committee list was still updated by some poor person on the 25th of December 2023 and hasn't been updated since. Are they really proposing to work differently? Are we going to see, as Sarah was saying, are we going to see a bigger role for metro mayors? We had that very early meeting in the growth mission. Are we going to see more industrialists brought in to help with the energy mission? How on earth is Wes Streeting, with sort of, cuts, lots of trusts facing financial difficulties, going to deliver some of the most tangible changes that he needs to deliver on saying Labour can actually improve the health service? So I think, they fought on an agenda of change, but actually a lot of the policies look quite similar. They need to start showing that actually a Labour government does mean a bit of change. And I think if your most tangible outcome is bowing to the inevitable and doing a prisoner early release scheme, that's probably not the change people thought they were voting for on July the 4th.
I'd also add to that, on the sort of mission point, is that two of the biggest news stories over the past couple of weeks have been the government's decision to ban smoking in pub gardens or whatever, and then the last couple of days, the government saying that, as far as I can see, that it was disgraceful that Ticketmaster were ripping people off for their Oasis tickets. And it seems to me that almost regardless of what you think of either of these issues from a public policy point of view, or even just as individual voters, the idea that these are sort of, big policy issues, or in any way central to, a mission-focused government means focusing on your missions. And these are just not our missions, right? These are not in the missions. And, if you allow yourself to be led or bullied or by the media into spending your time on this stuff, it does not bode well, in my view.
They weren't bullied on smoking, were they? I mean,
no.
I think that was a leak. I mean, so I don't think that was I don't think that was on the grid as, we will overshadow Keir Starmer's European reset in Berlin with an announcement about smoking in pub gardens. I think that was, someone got hold of the story, but then they let it run with Keir Starmer confirming the part of the tobacco and vapes bill, which is one of the bills, the Rishi Sunak's bill, that they clearly are adopting but amplifying as far as you can see. But, you don't want to do trivial government. For God's sake, you don't need to comment on Oasis tickets. However, if furious Keir Starmer is that no one stumped up for free tickets for him and the website kept crashing and he was asked to pay 350 quid or whatever to indulge his Galahad fantasies, I don't know. But you really should stop doing that, because one of the government selling points, one of Keir Starmer's big differences, is unlike the Conservatives, this is supposed to be a serious government by serious people. And that's why actually he shouldn't be drawn into those sort of, if you like, tabloidy 13th order stories, because that undermines a serious narrative. He also has said he will operate at a much higher level of integrity than those sleazy Conservatives. Bizarre they didn't spot the own goal of having a speech designed to draw attention to Dominic Cummings in the Rose Garden when it was originally scheduled in the last week of July. Didn't think, actually, now the crony accusations are about us, do we really want to remind people and do it last week? I mean, you could have chosen anywhere else to do that speech. You didn't have to be in a Rose Garden. You didn't have to be saying the Tories were sleazy, we're not, when everybody's saying, well, actually, we're not so sure about you now, mate. So I think it's really interesting. They do seem a bit flat-footed on how to do that. And that's part of the adjustment to government, that everything you do is quite a big story. In opposition, you're desperately seeking headlines because people aren't by and large that interested in you for most of the time. And whoever becomes Conservative leader on 2nd November is about to discover just how uninteresting you are 90% of the time when you're an opposition that nobody thinks is anywhere near power. But the trouble in government is everything you do is quite interesting, and you've got to have a good strategy for managing all of that. And as Jonathan says, to stick to the things that you want to tell the country are important and where you are making a difference.
I mean, just partly because I've been meaning to ask you this and haven't seen you for a couple of weeks, Jill, this thing on numbers of SPADs and worry about that leading to these appointments of people as civil servants. Who cares about the numbers of SPADs?
It's the ultimate sort of bubbly story that every prime minister comes in committed to saying, I'm not going to be like the previous guy. I'm going to have far fewer SPADs. I mean, compared to any comparable Westminster system, New Zealand, Canada, Australia, we have far, far fewer political advisors brought in. There are three routes to bring people in. You can bring people in as special advisors. They can do politics. You can bring people in as now sort of slightly oddly ill-defined class of what are called policy advisors, work directly to a minister, don't have a line civil service job, don't particularly want to play a party political role, but are there to give, official advice. You can imagine that Jonathan might become a sort of migration advisor to Yvette Coote. I'm not trying to get him a job or get rid of him. Yes, but you could imagine you'd have an expert advisor on something who doesn't want to be a party politician, or you can, as Labour has done a lot, make what are called direct ministerial appointments. Say, I would like a Menon review on, I don't know, whatever you want to review, Anand. The big pricing that's very dodgy is to say, actually, we'll use the exceptions process. I mean, the Conservatives did this too, but we'll use the civil service exceptions process to parachute people in. And they were parachuting some people in at quite high levels, and they actually parachuted my former colleague Jess Sargent in, who's actually, a really good person to have advising the government on constitutional matters. But for some reason, they thought the optics worked to parachuting her in as a deputy director level civil servant in the propriety and ethics group, not a deputy director of the propriety and ethics groups, but we had a bit of a prepositional collapse there, and that caused a really unnecessary row, and a horrible time for. I mean, just so cack-handed, it's unbelievable.
All right. I mean, Jonathan mentioned investment when talking about growth. I suppose this is for all of you, particularly maybe Ben and Jonathan. I mean, why does it seem that this government is so unwilling to borrow to invest? I was very struck during the election campaign in one of the debates where Ed Davey simply said, look, what we would do is we'd borrow. And we'd say borrowing for capital investment didn't count towards our fiscal rule, and that way we could generate growth. Isn't that a blindingly obvious thing that government could be doing in these sort of fiscally straitened times?
They certainly could be doing it, but it would require a change of, to the extent they have their fiscal strategy, and in particular of their fiscal rule, which the one that binds at the moment requires debt to be falling in 5 years. That makes no distinction between borrowing for different types of spending. If you were going to say, we're happy to borrow for investment, even if that means debt rising because it's going to achieve X, Y, Z, that would be a perfect coherent thing to do. They should make that case on its own terms. It would require a change of approach. And Richard Reeves is very prominently and publicly committed multiple times to that particular fiscal rule, which leaves you with a world where perhaps rather than making that case openly and transparently, they'll be looking at things like changing the definition of debt used for that fiscal rule, or maybe even something more radical about how, try not to drag us too far into the weeds, but about how the Bank of England treats losses on its balance sheet, which could potentially give her space for 10 to 20 billion pounds of extra investment. So I think that they haven't made that case, and they could do an about turn and start to make that case in a principled way, but it seems unlikely at this point.
There was a very interesting OBR report last week on this, wasn't there, on what, on the relationship between investment and growth, that seemed to make that case quite strongly, as far as I can tell.
It made that case extremely strongly, and hopefully it will provide, and what it shows is just how perverse the having a 5-year debt horizon fiscal rule is in this context, because it makes very clear that as you would expect, the benefits of investment in terms of growth come over gradually and over an extended period. And looking at the sort of impact on your net financial liabilities in 5 years' time is a pretty, from a purely sort of economic point of return on investment point of view, is a very odd way indeed. So, in other words, the current fiscal rule is clearly not just economically suboptimal, because all rules are in some sense economic, but it's sort of particularly dumb in this context. So I think it does make a very good case for not for ditching rules and as Ben said, having a sensible approach to fiscal sustainability over the long term, but for changing that particular rule. And hopefully they will indeed make that principled case.
If I could just add to that a little bit and come back slightly, I suppose, first of all, the OBR analysis is useful and important. It definitely points to this fact that everyone sort of knows, but it puts some numbers around it, that the returns and the benefits on what we call the supply side of the economy aren't going to materialize quickly, and they will take time. And if you focus purely on the next 5 years, you're going to miss a lot of the benefits of that investment. I think it's important for that. I think the magnitudes of the effects the OBR we're looking at are fairly small. They're not enormous. This isn't, you're not looking at a world where all this investment spending magically pays for itself if you just look at 10 years rather than 5. I still think there has to be an argument to be made for why borrowing more for investment at this moment in time makes sense. And I think that's where the debate should be, because I think you could equally argue that with an economy at close to full capacity, full employment, borrowing more for investment will have to sort of displace other economic activity potentially, rather than, it's not as though we've got millions and millions of people waiting to be called onto construction sites. And so I think there's a more nuanced argument we should be having about how any extra investment should be financed. Mm-hmm. And I think that questions about the fiscal rules are a part of that, but not the only one.
Okay, one here I think probably for you, Jill, which is how central are green policies likely to be to this government's policy mix, or do you think they're going to backtrack on some of their more ambitious pledges? A lot to work on there.
Well, it's quite interesting because today we've just had the results of what appears to have been a relatively successful offshore wind auction. Remember, the offshore wind auction this time last year was a complete failure because the government set what the industry said was a too low a strike price. The government, under these contract for difference regimes, sets a maximum price, and nobody wanted to come in that low, so they got no bids for offshore wind. So it's a bit of a flop. Ed Miliband is all over X saying this has been very successful, and I think a lot of people in the industry are very happy. And the price is considerably lower than the sort of marginal price of electricity at the moment. Whether it's a good long-run deal for taxpayers, I will leave to people who are more expert on that, or bill payers expert on that than me. I mean, I do think actually one of the really interesting things, and maybe this is because Ed Miliband effectively went back to what was his old department and hit the ground more running than others, is we actually have seen quite a lot of kick-starting stuff on those green pledges. We've had the appointment of Chris Stark, former chief executive of the Climate Change Committee, to run the energy side of the net zero and energy mission, from now sitting in something called Mission Control in DESNZ, and Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. Slightly shades of Dominic Cummings there, but and has ambitious plans to bring in lots of sort of engineers and planners if he can manage to make his way through civil service HR processes. Good luck with that, as they say. But anyway, so he's keen to get up and running. We had early decisions reversing planning blight on solar farms. We've had the rescinding of the de facto ban on onshore wind. So actually, there are sort of things moving on that side. There are, though, some really, really difficult blockages. And I think you can divide them into two camps. There's the logistics of it all. The UK is not the only country that spotted decarbonisation of its electricity system. So there is worldwide pressure on supply chains. Domestically, we have skills shortages. which we can't just say, hello, oh, Poles, Bulgarians, Romanians, would you all like to come over here because we pay a bit more than you'll get in your home country? So we have a big skills shortage issue. We have shortages of planners, and planning is very, very contentious. We've yet to see whether the pylon schemes really will get through planning committees, where local MPs is already shaping up to oppose and listen to the decisions. Some of those may be newly elected Labour MPs, since Labour now represents some slightly surprising places. Interesting to see how the Lib Dems play that. I think we already know from Adrian Ramsey's Notorious Today programme interview how the Greens are proposing to play that, where it's an issue. And there's this major logistical thing that at the moment it takes you 15 years to get connected to the grid. So as you don't have to be that au fait with energy systems to know that if you build it but can't connect it to the grid, which takes it to where people use it, you've actually not really solved the problem. So that, I think, is a really coming battle to sort that out. To be fair, Jeremy Hunt and the last Conservative government did recognise that, and we're starting to try and remove lots of zombie projects that are clogging up the grid queue, as it's known. So interesting to see where they go on that. I think the really difficult side is the bit that's not so much the energy decarb side. The difficult thing on the energy decarb will be squaring that with the government's commitment that this will reduce your energy bills relatively soon. And there were some unwise numbers, I think, put into the public domain, because one of the things we know about renewables is it may be a lot cheaper in the long run when you've been through this massive capital mountain to decarbonize the system. But there are huge numbers of upfront costs, and you've got to find ways of remunerating the people providing that. DESNZ may have ambitious plans to take levies off electricity and put it either on gas. The last government was contemplating that and then went very cold on that when the gas price shot through the roof after the Ukraine war. Treasury issued a call for evidence, but has never seemed to respond to it. So interesting there. Interesting to see, would they dare put that on general taxation? Bill payers versus taxpayers, much more efficient, of course, to pay for these things through generalized taxation than a specific charge on one set of consumers, particularly those who are doing the thing you want to do, which is to use electricity. But that would be quite courageous, I think, in current fiscal circumstances. Not obvious there's loads of money around to make that sort of switch. So I think that's quite demanding. And then we've got to see the other side. And this will be very interesting on where the Conservatives go, the things that actually matter to people. Because frankly, as long as the energy comes in at an acceptable price, we don't really care whether it's fossil fuel generated. As a consumer, I don't notice whether it's fossil fuel generated, it comes from renewables. What I care about is that there's a reliable supply at affordable cost, but then I do care about things which make me change the way I live, whether I can't replace my car with the car I want. I don't have a car, so I don't really actually care about that, but other people do. How I heat my home, whether I have to install some clunky heat pump as opposed to my nice gas central heating that I rely on, or whatever. And really interesting, I think, to see the extent to which whoever is the next Conservative leader decides to weaponize that. We saw some early moving away in the Conservatives from the sort of consensus position that we're all in this together and all going to the same place. Rishi Sunak's line was pragmatic and proportionate, as opposed to what he was characterized as zealotish and ideologically driven. But there was a sort of increasing number of Conservatives who were saying, actually, we should ditch the net zero targets completely. This is just crippling the economy for no gain. So I think it'd be interesting to see how quickly the government proceeds on the demand side as well as on the supply side. To what extent they actually are cash constrained on the supply side, and there isn't enough private capital forthcoming. We are promised GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund, but at much lower levels than the original numbers that they envisaged, and whether they run into opposition on the other side of the equation at the speed at which they want consumers to adapt.
And Sarah, I mean, I hope this isn't too clunky a segue, but I mean, the green transition is quite central to some of Labour's sort of regional strategy as well, isn't it? Whether it's sort of GB Energy being based in Scotland or whatever. So the two go hand in hand, don't they? And that's an obvious part of a regional policy strategy that Labour have been talking about in opposition, at least, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's already some examples of regions and specific places where there's real evidence of sort of green transition and green industries growing quite significantly. So Blyth in the northeast would be a good example. Sort of the role of some coastal communities around offshore wind, for example. I think, though, the challenge is that in any kind of regional policy, normally you want to kind of have some form of kind of long-term investment that's not just around particular sectors, but around kind of infrastructures that underpin the economy. So I think here, thinking about transport infrastructure, and actually I'd include skills and labour markets. And in that, we've already heard Jill speak about some of the labour market shortages we have in areas that might be associated with skilled apprenticeship training, for example. So I think trying to address those sort of what I would term as more infrastructure type issues in regional growth would be really important.
Okay, wonderful. We've got, predictably enough, quite a few questions about UK-EU relations, with people basically saying, are Labour going to address the economic impact of Brexit? So we can rephrase that. What do we think the prospects are for a closer UK-EU relationship that makes an economic difference under this government? Come on, this is easy stuff for us.
Now, this is where you have to nominate because we all want to come in, Anand.
Jonathan.
I think short term, small, medium term, hard to say. I think it's quite, it is quite difficult to see that any of the things that are currently on the agenda are going to make any large economic difference anytime soon. And in particular, although we don't know where they'll end up, the sort of messaging on the prospect of a youth mobility scheme with the EU, which clearly has become something of a symbol here for how serious they're going to be, it doesn't particularly bode well for much happening in the short term. Now, they have, of course, delayed introducing some more customs checks. So that's in some sense a negative impact, which has been sort of averted, at least for some time. And there'll be maybe more stuff like that. I do genuinely think, though, it's still too early to tell where things will settle down within the sort of 1 to 3 year horizon. So I wouldn't say no, they're not going to do anything at all that will make a meaningful economic difference, but I certainly think it's going to take some time.
I suppose the flip side on the customs thing is if we don't put the checks in place, then the EU's got no incentive to negotiate them away, which doesn't exactly help our exporters. But we shall see on that. Jill, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's already been clearly a very distinctly different sort of mood between the UK and the EU. I mean, that reset started under Rishi Sunak, but it's clearly delivered pace. And, Keir Starmer is either like me and wants to max out the number of passport stamps he gets in before the nightmare of the European entry system coming in November, or actually he's much more willing to put in the hard yards and go and see European leaders, particularly, he's been to Paris a number of times, as we said, for opening ceremonies, some wetter than others, but, had a chance to talk to President Macron. He's clearly got a very good relationship with Olaf Scholz, though the extent to which Olaf Scholz has time for anything other than trying to keep his coalition together and stave off the rise of the far right in Germany is a bit of a moot question, but he's clearly built a good relationship there. I think, as Jonathan says, the question is, what does that yield? I'm slightly more sympathetic than some others to the government, not jumping all over the EU youth mobility ideas at the moment, because at some point if there is to be some sort of negotiation, there needs to be a win for the EU to match any concessions to the UK, whether it's in terms of SPS agreements, some partial alignments and things like that. And the trouble is with the trade and cooperation agreement that Boris Johnson and David Frost negotiated is it's actually not a bad agreement from an EU predominantly goods exporter point of view, with a very much bigger hinterland that they could resupply into than the UK. So it's a very asymmetric agreement it stands. There are relatively few EU asks there. So the bit that I think is a bit more worrying is if you turn it into a great issue of principle where you're boxed into a corner and you can't then move down the line. Because at some point, I think we do have to say, yes, actually, we're prepared to have, you know, a few thousand students a year under Erasmus on a scheme that doesn't drain the UK exchequer. We're very happy, and frankly, open brackets, it'll help some of our labour shortages in low skill sectors, to have European, you know, teenagers, 20-year-olds coming over and working in, you know, bars and restaurants and cafes or whatever on the same basis that we allow Australians and South Koreans and Canadians to come. And I think, you know, we can move to those sorts of things. But at the moment, I would be holding back, because one of the other questions that I think is a really, really interesting question for Labour is, you know, are they thinking about some of the upcoming linkages they've got? We've got lots of reports about upcoming things, and one of the things we know is on the table for 2025-26 is fishing, and the expiry of the fishing deal. You know, are we ready to give any quota back in return for anything? You know, fishing industry itself is a bit split on what it makes of the new arrangements, depending on what sort of fish you catch and where you try to send them. What are we going to do about energy, climate, where there's slightly self-defeating loss of efficiency in electricity trading? So I think there's some sort of really interesting issues. And what I'm not sure about at the moment is whether this sort of combination, Nick Thomas-Symonds and the Foreign Office, you know, in the Cabinet Office and the Foreign Office are thinking through, you know, what are our really big asks, how are we going to get there? One of the things that I thought was most interesting in the King's speech, and we've written a bit about this on the UKICE website, it was the introduction, which I think we might see next week, if not early in October, of the Product Safety and Metrology Bill, aka let's give ourselves the powers to dynamically line with EU regulation if we think it's in the UK interest to do so. Oh, by the way, we could also use it to not align if we also thought that was in the UK's interest. So I think that's really interesting. It's one of the things that's always been a big question mark about anything that does require some form of dynamic alignment is, are we always going to have to take primary legislation every time the EU tweaks something? And you have to say, just in terms of trying to do that, that looked pretty unrealistic. And we've seen the problems that the Scottish government's come into with its desire to stay aligned as far as possible with the EU legislation. You just don't have the legislative bandwidth to do it. So I think that's a really interesting straw in the wind on where that's going. But I mean, you know, at the moment, one of the problems for the UK is it's got, you know, the big two in Europe, both distracted by domestic politics, which, you know, very pressing and very difficult domestic politics that cannot be postponed forever by having yet another major sporting event. And it's not got a commission at the moment. So Ursula von der Leyen is trying to recruit commissioners and apparently trying to stave off an all-male or nearly all-male commission with the nominations coming in from member states. So we won't really see who's even in charge of UK-EU relations until maybe November.
It does strike me that the legislation on dynamic alignment plus the decision not to have a European scrutiny speaks to a desire to completely depoliticize this as much as possible. I think it's probably a vain hope to depoliticize Brexit, to be perfectly honest.
It may be, I mean, maybe an attempt, you know, you could see that Hannah White and I from the Institute for Government have just written a blog today about the European Scrutiny Committee. And Bridget Fowler from the Hanson Society has actually just pointed out that we assume that the Windsor Framework Subcommittee of the House of Lords EU Affairs Committee would reappear, but apparently that's not been reappointed. So, so I'm going to have to amend my blog. But I think you could say, well, you know, actually maybe you didn't want to give Nigel Farage the potential to be on a select committee and be extraordinarily annoying if he could be bothered to turn up. But you do need somebody bringing together all these cross-connecting issues.
Yeah.
And I think the government also ought to be looking again at the way in which Parliament scrutinises trade treaties. I've been really quite struck and surprised by how enthusiastic this government seems to be about the CPTPP. I thought we wouldn't hear anything more of it after Liz Truss and Kemi Badenoch had sort of, exited state right for a bit. But the government does seem to be trumpeting imminent UK accession to that. But we know that the parliamentary arrangements on trade scrutiny were very, very inadequate. We've lost a dedicated select committee on trade with the abolition of the Department of International Trade. So I think it's really interesting. I mean, you can see why you want to avoid a platform for rows, but actually, I don't think it's a good thing in the longer run, or for for what is quite a difficult issue, which should be quite a big issue through the Parliament if Keir Starmer, really, really wants to do something different to the relationship we've seen so far.
Actually, the other thing that really strikes me is how keen the government has been to talk about the deal with Germany as being one of market access, which is going to irritate people in Brussels, I think.
And very interesting to see. I mean, other than say, could you put some forms in English or something like that? Yeah. It's really quite difficult to see what, within German competence you can do, as opposed to treading onto EU
public procurement, I suppose.
Competence. Public procurement. I mean, some of the things to make things a bit easier, but it's one of those things where the government needs to make sure it's not looking like the last government, which did have a very definitive preference for bilateralism over dealing with the Commission wherever possible. And I think it's quite important that the Starmer government makes it clear that it sort of respects the way in which the EU chooses to organise its business.
Yeah, I mean, actually, one other area we should touch on, I suppose, we sort of mentioned it briefly there, is immigration. Because, Jonathan, I know you and I wrote a piece where we were sort of naively optimistic about having a sort of more honest debate. And you wrote a really good piece in The Guardian. And in fact, it's so good, I have put it in the Slido if people want to click on it, about what an honest debate on immigration would look like. Are you hopeful that we're going to get such a debate and from this government?
I mean, I hope so. I'm still hopeful in that I do think that the government does want to, for political as well as economic or more sensible reasons, to sort of de-escalate the rhetoric around immigration, and in terms of its sort of political strategy for dealing with the aftermath of the riots, it is very much this sort of focus on, well, actually, we just need to get on. The primary focus is on just delivering better public services and economic development in areas that have been particularly badly affected. And while I don't think that is it's not the only thing you need to do, making that your key focus is actually a pretty good start and would certainly go some way towards helping. In terms of the debate on immigration, immigration is falling sharply now. It has been for some time, and we will see that in the figures. And I do hope that the government, and we will also, as Ben said, there are also some sectors where actually we need workers, and it's not, those are partly skilled sectors, but it's also areas which are not about sort of scientists, but about, for example, construction workers. So I do think that there is an opportunity to shift the terms of the debate, to refocus on the economic side in terms of how the UK benefits from immigration in the areas in which we need immigration, on the broader political side, in actually the way you, over the medium to long term, defeat the far right is by providing decent quality public services and economic developments in areas that haven't benefited so much, and on the social side by focusing on integration, where on the whole the UK has actually done pretty well over the past few decades. But there is still quite a lot more to be done, and we must avoid the risk of slipping back. So on all those fronts, I do think there are some grounds. There clearly are opportunities and there is some grounds for optimism. And I hope that, most importantly, perhaps, that looking over at Europe, looking over what happened in Eastern Germany over the weekend, they will draw the right lessons from that, rather than the wrong ones. So the right lessons being, you cannot appease the far right, or pander to them. That does not get you anywhere. But equally, that doesn't mean simply sticking your head in the sand and saying, la, 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 more immigration is fine. You actually need to, a multi-pronged strategy to address it.
But it will be genuinely interesting, won't it, that we see figures with immigration going down. Well, the government has to decide whether or not it says, actually, these figures are getting a bit too low, whether it's for universities or whether it's for the workforce.
Well,
I mean, it's slightly different.
Well, I think that, of course, we economists are always going to say, well, the headline figure tells you very little in itself. You need to look at the different categories, and focus on what you want to change in what direction for what reason. But hopefully it is much easier to do that in an environment where the figures are overall are falling significantly.
I think two really interesting areas to watch on this are universities and social care, where basically there is a fundamental trade-off, if you like, where if we do want to have fewer international students coming to UK universities, and we do want to have fewer people having visas to work in health and social care, as the figures show is happening this year, basically the government's got to stump up more cash, whether that's all students have to stump up more cash, but there's got to be more money comes from somewhere, whether that's from higher tuition fees or whether it's from taxes or whether it's from higher fees paid to care homes. Like that, if you want to have less reliance on immigration, then there's going to be, have to plug that gap somehow. And it's sort of, in an ideal world, you might put that to the British people. Are you willing to pay the higher taxes to stick an extra couple of billion into social care every year? If not, there are only so many choices, right? You can't have the best of all worlds all the time.
And presumably the same applies to what Labour was saying in opposition about we're going to deal with our over-reliance on migration by training people. I mean, you've got to train doctors and nurses. You've got to pay to train doctors and nurses.
And you have to pay to keep them working for you after they start work, and treat them a bit better than we currently treat junior doctors.
I mean, the NHS workforce plan, which is an enormous implicit promise on spending, has inside it contains a plan to try and reduce our reliance on recruitment from abroad. That's an explicit policy objective. It was far less forthcoming about what that might mean for paying conditions if we're to actually achieve that and to attract the right number of people, keep them, stop them leaving to go and become doctors in Australia or whatever. That is an explicit policy objective. It may become the same within social care, but again, that just adds to the pressures on public spending, of which Rachel Reeves has very, very many.
Yeah. We've got a quite specific and maybe slightly unfair question from Jeff Mackey, which I'm going to pose to you, Sarah, so brace, which is, are we expecting a real industrial strategy from this government? Make of that what you will. You've got high hopes on that front?
So I think in terms of one kind of unified document that sets out an industrial strategy, I think that might not actually be the best way of doing industrial policy. But I do think there's already early signs of a much clearer sense, both of working with business, so actually talking to business leaders, in some instances bringing business leaders into government, which I think is to be welcomed. I think this is particularly strong so far, as Jill's already set out, in relation to green and the green transition. I do think this is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I do think industrial strategy and policy for the UK needs to include services. And I think that's often an area that's neglected. So Labour has a plan for financial services, for example, that it has published. That in some ways points to continuity with what the Conservatives were doing, so pushing a greater emphasis on competitiveness and using financial services to support competitiveness and growth objectives. But there are some changes, so it also includes a greater interest in consumer protection. So potentially looking at some regulatory changes around consumer credit and the buy now, pay later market, for example. But that's often quite difficult to square consumer protections with growth in the financial services sector. So I think that's an area to watch. And I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to circle back to our very early discussion at the start of this conversation around what like serious government looks like. Because I think just towards the sort of tail end of summer, there's been quite a lot of kite flying around how or what tax changes might be brought about. And I think there are some signs that that's starting to unsettle business a little bit. And I think, you know, the sort of discussions around what the government might be doing on worker rights, what's happening around capital gains tax, pension reforms, etc. I think, you know, what the research shows is that stability, which Rachel Reeves emphasises a lot, is good for investment. And I think there's a risk that kite flying a lot of sort of potential tax changes without providing a clear strategy for businesses, probably not, at least in the immediate term, very conducive to investment. And there's just been a few signs, I'd say, in the past week, 10 days, that a little bit more clarity on that would be helpful.
Anand, I'm just interested in Jonathan's view about, you know, a lot of businesses are sort of, you know, saber rattling about the changes in employment rights that Angela Rayner wants to introduce, and particularly, you know, making it difficult to get rid of people from day one, acquiring rights, etc., etc. You know, does business have a case on this, or is this actually just sort of, you know, updating labour market practices and getting into the real world, and actually meaning that you know, bad companies won't be able to undercut good employers? I just wondered whether we should be worried about the interaction of that, because people are saying that's undermining their growth mission.
I mean, I think the answer is business does have a case, but of course, what they say in public is just a negotiating strategy and a negotiating position, right? Because the fact is, employment law is extraordinarily complicated. And all this is extremely technical stuff. And so both sides are staking out positions for what will be a negotiation. You know, my view, for what it's worth, but recognizing that because it's extraordinarily complicated, I don't fully understand everything, is that, you know, there clearly is a case. The biggest problem at the moment is the gap between the relatively good rights that most people in, you know, salaried employment, you know, in a proper contract of employment get, employees, and those people who are in various forms of insecure work, you know, i.e. Self-employment that arguably ought to be real employment, on abusive 0 hours contracts as opposed to 0 hours contracts which are sort of mutually agreed and mutually beneficial, and so on. And there clearly is a case for updating that and reducing some of the incentives, both through the tax system and through the rights acquisition system, that companies have to employ people on one type of contract rather than a contract which, in economic sense, would be more appropriate. The problem is that, you know, so I do think there is a good case for change. Equally, there definitely is a risk with around things like day one rights, where you could actually go too far and disincentivize employment, and they'll have to work that out. And it is very difficult. How do you tell the difference between a 0 hour contract that actually suits both parties well and you don't want to ban, and one which is pretty clearly abusive? It's actually very, very difficult to do that in a legal sense. But I'm not too worried, in the sense that, you know, this was one thing where which New Labour, I think, did pretty well. They were quite good, actually, at negotiate this sort of tripartite negotiating and ending up at a reasonably sensible place. So there is actually a blueprint for doing this, and hopefully they will follow it.
Interesting. We should probably get Catherine on one of these sessions to talk about this as well at some point. She knows about employment law. Now, there's been 2 or 3 questions about the sort of international dimension of this. I mean, Jill's touched on it with the EU and energy, but of course the other unknown at the moment is what's going to happen in the US in November. And a lot of these issues, whether it's a Paris climate treaty, whether it's trade and tariffs and so on, that could make a big difference to our government, couldn't it? So what do you think the potential implications are, say, of a Trump presidency should he win the election in November? Does anyone have a go at that?
I actually think that in terms of, would it have been different if we'd still had a Conservative government or a particularly sort of Rishi Sunak government? I think it probably doesn't make much difference. I think it does pose a bunch of problems to any UK government to have a US that is potentially more maverick, more isolationist, more sort of focused away or whatever. So, but I think the difference we will see is that the response to that is likely to be more coordinated between the Labour government here and other big European countries and the EU than it would have been under the Conservatives. So actually the sort of risk, if you like, the UK just becomes sort of irrelevant or sort of, collateral damage from from the sort of jostling between those two big beasts. What's very interesting about Trump, I think, is just how much he hates the EU, thinks the Europeans in NATO do a terrible job. I mean, he may tar Starmer with being part of the same brush, but Trump didn't really cut the Theresa May government any particular favors when he was there. I mean, the much vaunted trade deal would have been very much an America First trade deal, and Biden's shown no interest at all in doing that. So, but I think, will it be easier? I mean, the Conservatives said they would increase defence spending and committed to 2.5% by 2030, whereas Labour just commits by the sort of, when the finances allow. But that was really a sort of unfunded spending promise by the Conservatives. All of that would have to be dealt with in the next spending review, and we've got the defence review forthcoming. So I think it's going to make geopolitics much more difficult for everybody, not whatever the sort of Boris Johnsons and Liz Trusses say about thinking it'd be much better for the world. But I don't think it's going to be materially hugely harder for this government than it would have been for the others. And they, as with the Conservative predecessors, are trying to do a job in doing that. I think, it does make the appointment of the ambassador to the US quite interesting. And I always thought that Rishi Sunak made a slightly stupid move and a very short-sighted move in making that appointment before the election and the accompanying National Security Advisor appointment to replace Tim Barrow, both of which have now been undone.
I mean, I'd just add to that I think there is one risk from Trump which relates to some of the things that Ben and I were talking about before, which is that the event of either a Trump victory or a disputed Harris victory, the prospect of the US, the US's fiscal position is in some objective sense actually significantly worse than ours, in the sense that their trajectory is clearly unsustainable in a way which ours arguably isn't, and the politics of any meaningful sort of fiscal consolidation, and this is the case despite the fact the US economy is doing well, right? So, they are running this very large deficit at a time when the economy has done extremely well. And the politics of the US are such that meaningful fiscal consolidation is very, very difficult indeed. And it is not hard to conduct a scenario in which the US enter, I don't think it's a central scenario, but it is not hard to think of a scenario where the US ends up in a genuine fiscal crisis driven by politics, not the sort of underlying fiscal capacity of the US economy. And the implications of that for the UK would be pretty bad in fiscal terms, because if US Treasury yields jump out, so will ours, almost certainly.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. I wanted to get to this last question from Patricia Dawnlock, which is basically, if you assume, and I think it's probably right, that this government is in the strongest position politically it's ever going to be in, What is one policy you would like to see them introduce from this position of strength now that could make a meaningful difference? Got about a minute between you.
Council tax revaluation, or if they're being really ambitious, a proper attempt to get on top of how we tax land, wealth, and housing.
Brill. Who's next? You're never usually this shy, you lot.
Yeah.
Jonathan?
Indoor spends, and I'd also say a corresponding reform to the way that we uprate income-related benefits for children. Not just about abolition of the two-child limit, but a proper benefit strategy to address child poverty.
Jill?
I don't do policy, but I think that it's a shame that we've heard nothing from Keir Starmer on his integrity and ethics commission, and so I'm going to say his only move should be to establish that and appoint me to run it.
Wonderful. Sarah?
So I think it's taking the difficult decisions on tax to address public services, and actually particularly the NHS and schools.
Okay, I'm slightly disappointed that none of you said Menon for a peerage, but anyway, that's the obvious reform the country needs. Thank you so much, all of you. We just scratched the surface, but it was very, very interesting nonetheless. Thank you all for tuning in. If you're interested, I think it's next week, might be the week after, we're doing a whole lunch hour session specifically on Keir Starmer's reset with the EU, where we'll dig into that in far more detail than we've been able to today. But for the moment, thank you all as ever. Nice to see you. We'll see you all soon.